"This place isn't for losers," my mother said without blinking. I stood up and walked out. They didn't scream. They didn't beg me to stay. Just the scrape of forks, the weight of silence, and a gift bag I wished I hadn't brought. That night, they didn't just reject me. They erased me. It wasn't always like this. There was a time I believed family was a kind of gravity. No matter how far you drifted, it would pull you back. I thought if I kept showing up arms full of hope and holiday gifts, they'd eventually see me, not as a guest, not as a mistake, but as one of them. When I was little, Sundays smelled like roasted chicken and garlic bread, and the kitchen echoed with my father's off-key humming. Mom would fuss over the mashed potatoes while Daniel and I teased each other between mouthfuls. Back then, laughter came easy. Back then, I believed love was something you earned, like good grades or clean rooms or carrying in the groceries without being asked. And so I tried. Always. Even when the air began to change. The first signs were small. My spelling bee certificate went straight into a drawer while Daniel's soccer trophy sat on the mantel for months. When I asked Dad for help with a trade school application, he shrugged and said, "You'll figure it out." When Daniel failed a college class, Dad cleared his weekend to help him write an email to the professor. When I gave Mom lilies for Mother's Day, she said thank you and set them aside. When Daniel brought florist-arranged roses, she called them stunning and displayed them at the center of the table. I kept telling myself it's nothing, just bad timing, just bad luck. But patterns have a way of repeating themselves until they become fact. I was the one who fixed things behind the scenes. When Dad's lawnmower broke down, I repaired it in silence. When Daniel's apartment flooded, I wired him money I couldn't afford to give. When his car stalled at 2 a.m., I drove through black ice just to tow him home. When he needed a job, I coached him through his first interview, and every single time, no one said a word. Daniel took the credit. Mom and Dad beamed, and I stayed invisible. Still, I kept showing up, even when I shouldn't have, even when I knew better. On holidays, on birthdays, with gift bags full of meaning and hope I had no business carrying. I'd tell myself, maybe this time they'll notice. Maybe this time I'll finally matter. So I picked out the perfect scarf in emerald green, Mom's favorite color. I spent 2 hours choosing the watch for Dad engraving the back with thanks for teaching me to fix everything. It was my peace offering, my attempt yet again to earn a seat at their table. And that night, I walked into their house like I always had, with soft footsteps, careful words, a heart I hadn't quite given up on. But the moment I set the gift bag on the marble counter, I felt it. Not the cold from outside, the cold inside. The room looked like a holiday postcard, candles flickering, wine glasses catching the light, Daniel sitting tall in a crisp button-up, Sophia beside him smiling with practiced warmth. Everything was perfect, except me. My coat was still half-zipped, my sleeves still marked with the grease from a long shift. I didn't even have time to change. I'd come straight from the shop, because I didn't want to be late, because I thought being on time would matter. I stood in the doorway, hand still on the gift bag when Mom looked at me. And then she said it. "This place isn't for losers." I thought I'd misheard. I waited for a laugh, for anyone to jump in and say, "She didn't mean that." But no one did. Dad set his fork down with glacial slowness, like maybe if he moved slowly enough, I'd disappear on my own. Daniel kept staring at his plate. Sophia touched his hand, a gentle squeeze. "Stay still. Don't ruin the evening." "Mom?" I asked, my voice breaking like a snapped guitar string. "What did you just say, Karen?" She never liked being called Mom when she was angry, folded her napkin into a perfect square. Her tone was smooth, controlled. "You heard me," she said. "Tonight is Daniel's night. He's introducing Sophia to us properly. We want everything to be polished." Her eyes scanned my boots, the oil stain on my sleeve. "And you showing up like this," she said. "Well, it just doesn't fit. Doesn't fit." The words landed harder than any slap. "I showered," I said quietly. "I came straight here from work because I didn't want to be late." No one answered. Daniel didn't look up. Dad didn't move. Sophia blinked, then looked away. I felt the gift bag in my hand like a weight. I'd spent hours picking it all out. I'd imagined Mom smiling, Dad nodding just for a second of warmth. Now the bag felt small, pathetic, like a punchline to a joke I was too slow to understand. "You really don't want me here," I whispered. Karen sighed like I was being difficult on purpose. "Victoria," she said, "this isn't personal. It's just Daniel deserves his moment. He's worked so hard. And Sophia's family? They're people of stature. You wouldn't understand. Wouldn't understand." The room faded around me. I slid my arms back into my coat. I wanted to scream, to throw the gifts onto the table, to remind them that Daniel would have failed without me, that I'd paid his rent, covered his screw-ups, pushed him forward every time he faltered. But no words came, only silence. Daniel's fork hovered mid-air. His jaw was tight, but he said nothing. That was my answer. I turned toward the door. No one stopped me. No one followed. Outside, the wind cut through my coat. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking, but I didn't cry. Not yet, because part of me was still waiting for someone to call my name, still waiting to be chosen. I drove home in silence, my fingers wrapped so tightly around the steering wheel they left marks. The gift bag sat untouched on the passenger seat, its white handles glowing under the streetlights like a cruel joke. I didn't know why I brought it with me. Habit, maybe. Or hope. That if I took it back, I could pretend the night never happened, but I couldn't unhear those words. "This place isn't for losers." I replayed them over and over like a broken song stuck in my head. Each repetition carved a little deeper into me. At a red light, I glanced down at the bag, and something inside me cracked. I almost threw it out the window. Instead, I drove home. When I stepped into my kitchen, the house greeted me with stillness, the kind of stillness that used to make me feel small. Tonight, it felt like a refuge. No clinking plates, no forced smiles, no eyes judging my sleeves. Just me. I set the bag on the table and didn't touch it again. I made scrambled eggs and toast, not because I was hungry, but because cooking anything else felt like pretending, like acting out a part in a life that no longer wanted me. I sat at the table, eating slowly the scarf, still peeking from the tissue paper, like it was mocking me. The watch engraved with gratitude that would never be received lay perfectly nestled in its box, untouched, unwanted. I thought about all the times I had tried to earn my way into their world. The Mother's Day lilies, the Father's Day wrench set, the birthday cards no one opened. I remembered climbing onto the roof by myself, patching up leaks under the summer sun. My arms ached for days, but I didn't care. I wanted Dad to see me. I wanted him to say, "That's my girl." He never did. Instead, Mom laughed and said, if only Daniel had been here, he'd have done it straight. And Daniel, he just shrugged, never offered to help, never corrected her, never said, "Vic did that for you." I thought of all the moments I'd stitched into their lives without them ever noticing. And now I sat in a house I had built, with my own hands eating eggs alone, realizing it was never about effort. It was about invisibility. No matter what I did, they had already decided who I was, and they decided I didn't belong. I pushed my plate away. My stomach churned. The scarf, the watch, the note I had written inside the card that said, "Thanks for always believing in me." I had actually written that. I stared at those words now and felt something hot twist in my chest. They never believed in me. Not when I chose trade school instead of a 4-year degree. Not when I started working with my hands. Not when I came home covered in grease and pride. They didn't believe in me when I showed up with gifts. They believed in the version of me that stayed silent and stayed small. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had started falling again, quiet, soft, indifferent. My porch light flickered against the flakes. Somewhere across town, they were probably still at that table, laughing, toasting, talking about Daniel and Sophia's future. Sophia, the one with the elegant coat, and the family with stature. I could still hear my mother's voice. "You wouldn't understand." She meant you don't belong in their world. But the truth was, I understood more than she ever gave me credit for. I understood sacrifice. I understood what it meant to show up when no one asked. I understood love without conditions. They didn't, and maybe they never would. I walked back to the table, stared at the bag again. In another version of this night, I would have driven back, placed it gently at the front door, rang the bell, and walked away without a word. But that version of me was gone. The girl who tried to fit into their picture-perfect frame was gone. All that was left was the woman they never saw coming. I took a deep breath and said it aloud just to hear it in the air. No more. No more last chances. No more trying to prove my worth. No more mistaking proximity for love. I wasn't leaving the table. I was burning it down, at least in my heart. That night, I let the silence speak, not as a punishment, as a declaration. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache and the rage and the grief, I felt the first flicker of something dangerous and beautiful. Freedom. It started with a podcast, not some grand plan, not a moment of revenge, just a quiet Tuesday night alone in the garage, grease under my nails and the hum of a busted alternator ringing in my ears. I was 22, exhausted, hungry, wearing boots with a hole in the sole. And then a podcast about investing came on the radio while I worked. I didn't understand most of it. Index funds, dividends, compound interest. It sounded like a foreign language, but something about the way the host spoke calm, steady, certain stuck with me. I wanted that certainty. I wanted something no one could take from me. So the next morning, I went to the library. I checked out a book called The Simple Path to Wealth and read it like my life depended on it. In a way, it did. I had no financial cushion, no family safety net, no mentor waiting to guide me. What I had was $700 in a savings account and a growing awareness that if I didn't change something, I'd spend the rest of my life trying to prove myself to people who'd already made up their minds. So I opened a brokerage account. My hands trembled as I clicked buy on my first index fund. It felt like setting fire to everything I'd been taught, that money was to survive, not grow. But that click changed me. I didn't tell anyone, not my coworkers, not even Maya. I didn't want anyone's judgment or advice or commentary. This was mine. Every dollar I saved went into that account. I skipped new boots that winter, ate ramen 3 nights a week, took every side gig I could find, oil changes, carburetor rebuilds, last-minute tows in the snow. Every job paid for another tiny sliver of independence. My coworkers teased me, called me stingy, a penny pincher. One even laughed and said, "What are you trying to retire at 30?" I didn't answer. Let them laugh. They didn't know what I was building. By the time I turned 25, I had over $40,000 invested. It wasn't flashy. No luxury car. No designer bag. Just quiet confidence growing with every dividend. When I bought my first house at 28, no one believed it. A rundown 3-bedroom wreck with peeling paint and a furnace older than I was. Why waste money on that dump, Mom said when she saw the photos. Daniel laughed. "You're gonna die fixing that place." They didn't come to help. They didn't even ask how I'd done it. But I fixed it. Every pipe, every floorboard. I learned how to rewire outlets, patch drywall, tile a bathroom. YouTube became my mentor. Sweat became my currency. And little by little, that dump became home. The thing is, I still wanted them to notice. Even after everything, I caught myself imagining what it would be like for Mom to walk through the front door, see the polished floors, the framed photo of me on the wall, not Daniel, not Sophia, and say, "Wow, you did all this," but she never did. She never came. And I stopped waiting. Instead, I kept building. By 30, my portfolio crossed the 6-figure mark, quietly. No celebrations, no announcements, not even a Post-it note on the fridge. Just a moment alone in my kitchen, a cup of cheap coffee in hand, staring at the numbers and whispering, "I did this." Last year I hit $1.3 million. Even typing that number now feels surreal. Me, the loser, the distraction, the one who didn't belong at the dinner table. I built a life they couldn't even imagine, and I did it in silence. Because I knew deep down if they ever found out, they'd twist it. Suddenly, I'd be valuable, Not as their daughter, not as their sister, but as a resource. And I wasn't going to let them claim something they never helped build, so I kept it quiet. I didn't buy a new car, didn't upgrade my wardrobe. My boots still had grease stains. My hands were still calloused. I looked like the same girl who showed up to dinner and got called a loser, and that was the point. Let them believe I was nothing. Let them talk about Daniel's job, Sophia's pedigree, their upcoming wedding full of important guests. Let them sip wine and toast to their success. Meanwhile, I was building an empire from the basement, not for revenge, not for pride, but because I needed to know I could survive without them. And now, every time I logged into my account, every time I ran my hand across the smooth kitchen counter, I installed myself every time I parked my beat-up truck in the driveway of a house I fully owned, I reminded myself I don't need to be seen to be real. I don't need their applause to be enough. But sometimes, just sometimes, I'd catch myself looking at that scarf and watch still sitting in the same gift bag untouched on the shelf and wonder, what if they knew? What would Mom say if she saw that I remembered her favorite color? What would Dad say if he turned the watch over and read the engraving? Would Daniel admit the truth, that without me he wouldn't be standing where he is? I'd shake the thought away. Because those questions didn't matter anymore. I wasn't building for them. I was building for me. And that was the most dangerous truth of all. It was 5 days after the dinner. I was in the garage, sleeves rolled up, elbows deep in the engine bay of an old pickup when I heard the sound. Car tires crunching fresh snow. I wiped my hands on a rag heart, already uneasy. Customers didn't come through the back entrance, and no one ever pulled into my driveway unannounced unless they had something to prove. I stepped outside, and there they were. Mom, Dad, Daniel, Sophia, standing in my driveway like ghosts from a story I thought I'd closed. Mom held a tin of cranberry muffins. Dad had his hands shoved in his coat pockets. Sophia wore heels too delicate for snow. And Daniel looked furious. "Victoria," Mom said with a forced smile. Her voice was too light, too practiced. "We thought we'd drop by, check in on you." I didn't smile. I didn't even blink. "After calling me a loser and asking me to leave the table," I said. Sophia shifted, clearly uncomfortable. Daniel's jaw clenched. "You should have told us," he snapped, "about everything." My hands dropped to my sides. "Told you what?" Daniel took a step forward. His voice wavered with something between hurt and rage. "That you helped me get my first job, that you vouched for me when I nearly got fired, that you covered for me." Silence cracked between us like ice underfoot. "How do you know that I asked, even though I already suspected?" Sophia spoke, her voice clipped. "Evan told me. Said you practically trained him. Said without you, he wouldn't have even known how to change a carburetor. And then he mentioned the investments." Her eyes locked onto mine. "That you've been sitting on over $1 million and never told anyone." There it was, the secret no longer mine. Dad cleared his throat. "We had no idea, sweetheart." I laughed, not a soft laugh, a bitter one, sharp enough to cut through bone. "Of course you didn't," I said. "You never asked." Daniel stepped forward, voice rising. "Do you know how humiliated I felt Evan kept talking about how much he admired you in front of Sophia, in front of her parents? I looked like a fool." "You looked like the real you," I said calmly. His face twisted. "You could have at least warned me. Instead, you let everyone think you're still some broke grease monkey. You made me look like nothing compared to you. That did it." My calm cracked. "I made you look like nothing I said, stepping forward. No, Daniel. You did that all by yourself. I built everything in silence while you bathed in applause I handed to you." Mom finally stepped in, voice trembling. "Victoria, that's not fair. We were just trying to give Daniel the best start." I cut her off. "And what about me? Where was my start? Where was my applause?" Every time he stumbled, I caught him. Every time I stood up on my own, you turned away. Sophia looked between us like she was realizing she had walked into a house of cards. Dad muttered, Maybe we can talk about this inside. No, I said sharply. We're not doing this in my house. Not until you tell me why you're really here. Silence. And then predictably, it came. Dad shifted. Evan mentioned something about an auto parts distribution idea. He said, "You've got the capital, the knowledge." He thought maybe I held up a hand. There it is. Daniel jumped in. "It could help all of us, Vic. You've got resources. I've got contacts. We could build something." "This isn't a pitch meeting," I snapped. "You came here because your pride is bruised, because suddenly the loser doesn't look like one anymore, and you want in." Daniel's face flushed with anger. "You think you're better than us?" "No," I said. "I know I built something better than what you ever imagined I could, and that terrifies you." Mom reached for my arm. "Sweetheart, we're still your family." I stepped back. "No, you're people who used to be my family. Now you're just faces who want access." She flinched. "You don't get to erase me for years and then come back when it's convenient." I continued. "You don't get to throw me out of dinner, call me a disappointment, and then ask for business advice over muffins." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "You're so full of yourself now." "No," I said quietly. "I'm finally full, after a lifetime of starving for your attention." Sophia whispered something to Daniel, but he shook her off. Dad looked down at the snow. "We just didn't realize." "That's the problem," I said. "You never wanted to realize. Because if you did, you'd have to face what you've done. You'd have to admit that the daughter you ignored outbuilt you all. Quietly. Completely. Alone." The wind picked up. No one spoke. And in that stillness, something shifted. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking. They were. The wind stung my cheeks, but I barely felt it. My blood was louder. I looked at them, my so-called family, and realized something heartbreaking. They hadn't come to make things right. They'd come to make me small again. "You never cared." I said, my voice, calm but cutting. "Not once. All those years I tried to belong, you never saw me, and now that you know I have money now, you show up at my door." Mom blinked hard, her lips trembling. "It's not about money, Victoria," I snapped. "Don't lie to me. If Evan hadn't said anything, you'd still be sitting at that table calling me a loser." Dad finally lifted his eyes. His voice came out small. "We didn't mean to hurt you." I laughed, cold, bitter, but somehow still hollow. "You didn't mean to see me either. That was the whole problem." Daniel exploded. "You're throwing away your family over some hurt feelings." I stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath my boots. "This isn't about hurt feelings. This is about years. Years of being overlooked, mocked, erased. This is about being the one who held the net while you danced on the high wire, and then being told I was dragging you down." Sophia touched Daniel's arm. "Daniel, is that true?" He hesitated. That pause told her and me everything. "She's exaggerating," he muttered. I shook my head. "Exaggerating. You want proof? I have receipts. Bank statements, screenshots, texts at 2 a.m. when your car broke down and you begged me not to tell Dad you'd failed your emissions check again." He flinched. Mom stepped forward. "We made mistakes. We're sorry. But we're here now. That has to count for something." I stared at her for a long time, and then I said the one sentence I had always dreamed of saying but never thought I'd have the strength to mean. "Too late." Dad stepped forward. "We could start over." "No," I said firmly. "We don't start over because you're uncomfortable. We don't start over because now I'm useful to you. That's not love. That's strategy." Daniel scoffed. "Wow. So now you're better than all of us?" I met his eyes. "No, I'm just not beneath you anymore. And that's what you can't handle." Sophia looked down at the snow, visibly shrinking. No one had anything left to say. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. The warm glow from inside spilled out onto the frozen porch. But I didn't step aside. I stood there like a line they couldn't cross. "What happens now," I said, my voice steady, "is that you leave. And you decide out there whether you can ever love me for me. Not for what I have. Not for what I can give you, For me. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was revelation. For once, I wasn't afraid of it. Mom's hand twitched like she wanted to reach out, but she didn't. Dad bowed his head. Daniel muttered something too low for me to catch and turned back to the car. Sophia followed, looking back once before disappearing into the snow. I stood in the doorway as they pulled away. No one looked back. I closed the door slowly, gently, not out of anger but out of clarity. Inside the house was quiet, not lonely, just still. The gift bag still sat on the shelf, the scarf folded, the watch untouched. But I no longer looked at them with sorrow. They weren't relics of failure anymore. They were proof that I had tried, that I loved first, that I gave first, that I showed up first, even when no one ever did for me. And now I had shown up for myself. It's been almost a year since the night I closed the door. Since then, the seasons have turned like pages in a book I no longer need their signatures on. Winter melted into spring, spring into summer, and now autumn settles in quiet, golden forgiving. I haven't seen my parents since that day. Daniel called once, months ago. He asked, without saying the words directly, if I'd reconsider helping him with a business pitch he couldn't get off the ground. I said no. He hung up without saying goodbye. Oddly enough, the silence that used to cut me now feels like freedom. I used to think silence meant abandonment. Now I know it can also mean peace. In that quiet, something beautiful began to grow. It started with a message from a girl I barely remembered, someone I'd met in trade school years ago. She said she'd heard rumors, that I'd built something big, that I knew how to take scraps and turn them into something solid, that she wanted to learn. I almost didn't respond. But then I remembered what it felt like to start from nothing, to feel invisible. So I invited her to meet me at the garage on a Sunday afternoon. One conversation turned into 5. 5 turned into 10. And before long, there were 6 women in that garage, then 12 sitting on overturned milk crates, notepads in hand, asking me how to open their first brokerage accounts. These weren't trust fund kids. They were welders, mechanics, line cooks, women with calluses on their palms and ambition in their eyes. And every single one of them had been told, just like I had, that people like us didn't belong in boardrooms, that we didn't fit. I stood in that stained garage, chalk in hand, explaining compound interest on the back of a grease board, and for the first time in my life, I felt what I had chased at my parents' dinner table for decades, belonging. And then there was Mrs. Anderson, my next-door neighbor, 78 years old, sharp as a tack and full of sass. Every week she'd wave me over to help fix a faucet or change a light bulb, and she always paid in cookies or pie. We'd sit in her kitchen drinking lukewarm tea while she told me stories of her late husband. She once said, "Home isn't where you're born, it's where you're seen." Those words stuck with me, and of course there's Maya, my constant. She'd show up with 2 coffees and a bag of powdered donuts, plop herself on my porch, and ask, "You working?" or just pretending to be productive. She never asked about my net worth. Never asked for a loan, never once treated me differently after she found out. She only cared if I was okay. One evening, as we sat watching the apple trees I planted begin to bloom, Maya asked, "Do you ever think about going back?" I didn't need her to clarify. I knew what she meant. I looked at the soft petals drifting in the breeze and said, "Not unless they can love me without the $1 million, without the house, without the armor." She nodded slowly. "They probably won't." "I know," I said, "and that's okay, because I'm not building for them anymore." Later that night, I walked through my yard boots, crunching against grass kissed by the first frost of the season. The apple trees stood young, but steady roots digging deeper branches stronger. They were mine. They were enough. Inside, the scarf and the watch still sat in their gift bag, untouched, unopened. There were times I thought about throwing them away, but I never did, because they weren't symbols of rejection anymore. They were reminders of the girl who kept trying, who kept loving, who kept hoping even when hope was the loneliest thing in the world. I ran my fingers along the ribbon and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me who I am." And that night, in the soft glow of my kitchen light, I said the words I had never dared to believe, not really, not fully, until now I am not a loser. Have you ever been pushed out of a place that was supposed to feel like home? Have you ever had to rebuild yourself quietly while no one was watching? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story spoke to something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You're not alone, not anymore.